Welcome everyone to the Stateless Atheist. Today, I'm going to do a deep dive into Richard Spencer. This video is not in any way to praise him. It is, instead, because I despise him and everything he stands for. This video is so people understand his views and strategy, so they can counter him and his army better. The video is going to be broken up into a few parts. I will begin by describing his life and then move on to his views. After which, in part 3, I'm going to specifically talk about his AltRight Manifesto. Then I will end with my thoughts on everything I discussed. I am getting most of my material from this book, Key Thinkers of the Radical Right, Behind the New Threat to Liberal Democracy, of which there is a chapter on Richard Spencer. If you would like me to do any of the other thinkers in this book, please leave a comment below. Without further ado, let's begin. Richard Spencer was born in 1978 to Rand Spencer, an ophthalmologist, and Sherry Spencer, an heiress to cotton farms in Louisiana. He spent his early life in Dallas, Texas. Throughout his life, he did not suffer any financial hardship or any major life crises. Throughout high school, he was not considered brilliant, but he did mature intellectually. He went on to receive a BA in English Literature and Music from the University of Virginia in 2001. Followed up by earning a master's in humanities from the University of Chicago only 2 years later. Then in 2005 to 2006, he studied at the Vienna International Summer University, which started his links to European culture, identity, and history, which we will learn are a big part of his themes. After returning to the United States, he spent 2 years as a PhD candidate at Duke University, where he studied modern European intellectual history. This is where he met Stephen Miller, who would later become Donald Trump's senior policy advisor. He claims on his website that he did not finish his education because it was the pursuit of a thought crime. What sets Spencer apart is not his academic writings, but his oratory skills and strategy, which I will cover later. In 2007, he was the assistant editor to the American Conservative. Allegedly, he was fired for having views too extreme for the magazine. Then from 2008 to 2009, he was the executive editor of Talkies magazine, which he published by Greek paleoconservative journalist and socialite Take Theodorakopoulos. By 2010, he rejected both the Democrats and the Conservatives and started AlternativeRight.com, which he edited until 2012. In 2011, he became the owner and executive director of Washington Summit Publishers, and he also became president and director of the National Policy Institute. Then in 2012, he founded Radix Journal as a publication of Washington Summit Publishers, which had major contributions from major alt-right thinkers. In 2014, he was deported from Budapest after trying to organize the National Policy Institute conference. Despite Hungary, at the time, having one of the most nationalist regimes in all of Europe, President Viktor Orban thought that Spencer was too radical. Jump ahead a few years to 2017, and Spencer, non-coincidentally, starts AltRight.com on Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday. When Trump was elected, Spencer was optimistic about Trump's anti-establishment, anti-immigration rhetoric. Today, he also hosts a weekly podcast called Vanguard Radio and is married to Nina Koprianova, who has translated numerous books written by Alexander Dugin into English, which has been published by Spencer's publishing company, Washington Summit Papers. In his book, The Uprooting of European Identity, he writes, "The white man lives in a world his race once dominated, in which black and brown are now colonizers, in which European heritage is being taken away piece by piece. Cultural heroes? Damn, he must be pissed with the removal of Confederate statues these days. But I digress. Literature, popular icons, identity, ultimately everything. He further describes whites as victims and describes non-whites as vengeful and intent on destroying white identity. Spencer gets his belief that multiculturalism is genocidal on the white race from Greg Johnson, who is more interested in contemporary white genocide than the Holocaust. Spencer rejects the mainstream right, which he identifies with 5 characteristics: free market capitalism, genetic Christianity, staunch support for the United States military, unambiguous support for the State of Israel, and a value-based conception of American identity, which is universal rather than ethnically based. He rejects all these views for a more radical politics. He rejects capitalism because, in his view, all economics should serve the needs of the people of the nation. He rejects Christianity, instead referring to himself as a cultural atheist. He supports the United States military, but rejects its moral-based interventions around the world. Instead, he believes the military should only be used for U.S. interests around the world. He is not much of a supporter of Israel and is an anti-Semite. Finally, he believes in an explicitly ethnically based conception of American identity, where he rejects immigration and calls for a white ethnostate. In 2017, Spencer published his manifesto, also known as What It Means to Be Alt-Right, a metaphysical manifesto for the alt-right movement. It was writing to influence the masses of white Americans who identify with either liberal or socialist multiculturalism. He took his ideas from other manifestos, of which his manifesto has 20 points. I will now go over most of them. His first point is strictly about race. He says race is real, race matters. Race is the foundation of identity. White is shorthand for a worldwide constellation of peoples, each of which is derived from the Indo-European race, often called Aryan. European refers to a core stock: Celtic, Germanic, Hellenic, Latin, Nordic, and Slavic, from which related cultures and a shared civilization sprang. What is interesting here is, as many white nationalists would exclude Latin and Slavic peoples, Spencer instead calls for all whites to unite. He believes both major parties call for open borders that dilute the white race and promote a multiculturalism. He further argues that Jews are ethnically distinct from Europeans and are resistant to assimilation and often hostile to their hosts. Judeo-Christian values to him is nothing more than a political slogan, and argues that it ignores the history of both Jews and Europeans. In point 3, he goes on to describe his views of the ethnostate. Spencer was the first to use this term, and it is picked up by the mainstream. He writes that nations must secure their existence and uniqueness and promote their own development and flourishing. The state is an existential entity and, at its best, a physical manifestation of a people's being, order, and will to survive. Racially or ethnically defined states are legitimate and necessary. Of this, we can see he argues against civic nationalism, which he believes should be replaced with ethnic nationalism. In point 4, Spencer talks about what he calls metapolitics. He wants to differentiate himself from fascism and Nazism by rejecting political violence and terrorism. He even condemned the killing of the liberal counter-protester at Charlottesville's Unite the Right march. This is all part of his strategy to become mainstream by being allowed on college campuses and news programs. He further believes people will be more accepting of his views because, as a result, he seems more reasonable. Then, if points 1 and 3 did not spell it out enough, he specifically calls for a white America in point 5. He argues that non-whites and non-Protestants had no role in the creation or growth of the country. In point 6, Spencer talks about how Europe has the blood and soil, or as he calls it, bone and blood of the white ancestors. Point 10, he moves on to foreign policy. Here, he details how immigration and foreign interests should be completely in the interests of the white race. In point 14, he calls leftism an ideology of death and says it must be confronted. In points 15 and 16, he further rejects capitalism and globalization. He says that globalization threatens not just Europeans, but every unique identity on Earth. Spencer, in point 18, blames baby boomers for not passing on the legacy of European civilization to their children. and that they are therefore to blame for today's left liberal views in the country. Points 11 and 12 are the only views that would fit into a classical liberal or anarchist viewpoint. In them, he supports free speech and the right to bear arms. There's a lot to talk about here, and where should I begin? Well, let's start with where I agree with him. I agree with him unabashedly about free speech and the right to bear arms. I would partly agree with him on the United States military. We shouldn't be using it to force our morality on the world, but I would take it further and say we should not use it for our interests either. I would rather disband it, but if it exists, it should be nothing more than a defensive force. Israel, like any other state, I do not support its government, but I support the people in the country, given that any individual is not an abuser or a bigot. Capitalism, as it has become, I also reject, but not for the reasons he does. I would rather a more equitable playing field in capitalism, which is built on the enclosure movement, state-enforced property rights, and modern-day rent sinking, has rejected that. On the issue of race, that is more complicated, because academics do not agree on if race is natural or socially constructed. I will, in a later video, be discussing different views of race from this book here. If you are interested in exploring the different concepts of race, please comment below. Finally, when he argues that racially or ethnically defined states are legitimate and necessary, a few things come to mind. First of all, this makes me think about Hoppe's covenant communities. Did one of them influence the other, or did they have a common person that influenced them both? Being an anarchist, I think that states are neither necessary nor legitimate, but both of those topics are so large and require many videos, but I do want to end with a quote from Robert Wolf's thesis. In his book, In Defense of Anarchism, which I'm going to make a video on later in this week, Wolf argues each of us has an overriding obligation to be morally autonomous, and autonomy can only be preserved in the legislative process if every person bound by the law participates directly in the making of the law. And furthermore, only if each person is bound by those laws which he or she has voted. In other words, according to Wolf, the modern state is a logical impossibility. Thank you everyone for listening. I am a new channel and I want to continue to put out great content for you. I would really appreciate if you like and subscribe and share my videos. The more subscribers I have, the better my videos will become. Let's see if we can get to 200 subscribers by the end of the summer. Thank you, and I'll see you soon. Thank you everyone for joining me. Please like and subscribe. I'll see you soon.